Once, there was an old man that lived in a falling down old log cabin on the side of a mountain. That old man had lived in that cabin almost all his life. Now, he hadn't been an old man, of course, all his life. He built that cabin when he was a young man. He took a walk up that mountain, and he thought that was just the prettiest place he'd ever seen in his life. And he thought, this is where I want to spend the rest of my life. So he took it on himself to cut down some trees, make himself a cabin. He cleared the land, made himself a good garden, and there was plenty of wildlife, so he could hunt and fish, and he had more than he needed, really. Every once in a while, he would go into town, about once a year, just to stock up on things he might need. Shoes, usually, maybe a new jacket. And always, he would get a big bag of beans, because beans are good food. They take care of you through the winter, and they're easy to store, and they don't cost much money. Well, time went on, and that old man got older and older. Those trips into town got fewer and fewer. And time was he didn't even go to town anymore, but his neighbors would look in on him, and whenever they'd come, they'd bring him a bag of beans. Now, as that old man got older, it got a lot harder for him to garden, and it got a lot harder for him to go out and hunt. So it came to the point where all that old man ever had to eat was beans. Beans for breakfast, beans for lunch, and beans before he went to bed at night. And he got really sick of those beans. Now one night, it was towards the end of fall, just the beginning of winter. He was cooking a big pot of beans on his wood stove, and he stood there stirring those beans, thinking about how long he'd lived in that cabin, and thinking about how many beans he must have eaten over his lifetime, when he felt a draft coming in up from the floor, and he looked down and he noticed that a piece of the floorboard was missing. Now, he had noticed it before, and he'd meant to fix it, and he thought to himself, you know, I've really got to take care of that before the cold weather really sets in. So he was watching that really carefully, thinking just what size of piece of wood he was going to have to cut to patch that floorboard, when all of a sudden, from underneath his own house, he saw two red eyes staring back at him. Well, that man took a step backwards, and before you know it, a critter jumped out of that hole and started to run around and around and around his table. Well, that old man called his old dog, which was almost as old as the old man, and that dog started to chase the critter around and around and around the table. And the old man picked up his big hunting knife, and just as that critter passed in front of him, he brought that knife down, and wah! The critter let out a cry and ran out the front door, and the man looked down, and all that was left was the tail of that critter. Well, his dog had chased that critter out into the woods, and the man came back and he picked up that tail. He picked it up by the skinny, rat-like, pointy end of that tail, and he looked at that tail, and he looked at that pot of beans, and he looked at that tail, and he looked at that pot of beans. And he thought how long it had been since he'd had any meat to eat, and he dropped that tail right into that pot of beans. Well, finally his dog came back, and the man dished out a dish of beans for the dog, and then he dished out a dish of beans and tail for himself. And that man ate every last bean on that plate, and then he picked up that tail. This time, he picked it up by the stumpy end that he'd cut off, and he held it above his head, and then he just let it slide on down. That man hadn't felt so good in a long time. He felt full and satisfied, and instead of just going to bed like he usually did after dinner, he sat down in his rocking chair and he rocked back and forth. Now, like I said, it was the end of autumn, just the beginnings of winter, and the wind was starting to really pick up on that mountainside. And the man sat there next to his wood stove in his rocking chair, listening to that wind howl around the outside of his cabin, when all of a sudden he heard scratching, scratching, scratching up on the front porch, and he heard Tailypo, Tailypo, give me back my Tailypo. Dog! That man cried. You get out there and chase that critter away. And he threw open the front door and he pushed that dog back out on the porch. And the dog went off into the woods after that critter. And that man sat down. He wasn't feeling quite so satisfied as he had been a couple minutes before. He was feeling a little nervous as he sat there in his rocking chair, rocking back and forth, back and forth. Finally, he heard his dog come home. He let him back in, and that dog was so tired from chasing that critter, he just crawled right under that man's bed and went to sleep. But that man was a little too worried to go to sleep himself, so he sat there rocking back and forth and back and forth. And as he sat there, all of a sudden, he heard thunk, thunk, thunk on his roof. And then he heard it again. Tailypo, Tailypo, give me back my Tailypo. Well, the old man grabbed that dog and he pulled him out from under the bed and he pushed him out on the front porch and he sent him off after that critter again. And that dog did. He wandered off into the woods. And that man sat down in the rocking chair and he rocked back and forth, waiting for that dog to come back. But that dog never did come back. That critter took it out in the woods, got it lost, or worse. And while that man sat there waiting, he heard the wind howl louder and louder around the cabin. And finally, he crawled into his bed. And he sat there with the covers up to his chin, shaking, just waiting for what would happen next. And then he heard scratching, scratching, scratching right at that same hole in his floor that he still hadn't patched. And then at the foot of his bed, he saw two red eyes looking right at him. And then he heard, Tailypo, Tailypo, give me back my Tailypo. And that's the last anyone ever heard of that old man. But they say that if you go up that side of that mountain, and you see the ruins from where his cabin used to stand, and if you listen to the wind, you can hear it. You can hear it say, Tailypo, Tailypo, now I've got my Tailypo.